Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and today we're going to ask the question, is Kedusha, sanctity, contagious? The reason we're asking this is because the opening Mishnah in the ninth chapter of Zevachim on 83a, Pei Gimel Amud Aleph, basically states that the Mizbeach, the altar, is mikadesh, actually sanctifies et ha'ra'uilo, a korban that was originally appropriate for it, but somehow became invalidated. But even though that korban is no longer valid, even though that korban is puzzle, because it already went on the altar, it does not get taken down. Now, what is that? It sounds like what things that touch the altar. It's like contagiously kadosh. Like what exactly are we supposed to be understanding here? So there's two basic ways of thinking about this. And of course, the question of which offerings this applies to, like does this apply to a wine libation, which doesn't usually get burnt on the altar, or does it only apply to things that get burnt on the altar and they stay up there? But there's two different ways of thinking about this generally in terms of the commentators. One way of thinking about this is to basically say, look, yeah, you started a process, even though this, let's take a korban ola, right? A burnt offering. Even though this korban ola has become invalidated at some point, it's already up on the mizbeach. Just continue the process, right? Even though it isn't the perfect ola, even just continue the process. There's something about not wanting to stop the process. There's another way that says, no, we're really talking about some sort of not contagiousness, but the power of the Mizbeach is such that if things go on it, they became kadosh and you can't get rid of them. It's not like, meaning you can't just take them down. It's not like anything you burn up there that ended up on there in a way that it shouldn't have. It's not like we consider that an actual process of completing a korban. It's the same as burning wood up there. But the point is, once it goes up to the Mizbeach, it gains a certain status and it has to stay up there. It can't come down. These are the two different ways of looking at it. And I want to try to build out each side of this in order to see, get some philosophy out of it, get some bigger ideas out of it. So let's start with the perspective that really looks at this as, look, even though the item, even though the korban is puzzle, even though it's not really appropriate to be given as a korban anymore, you started the process and therefore we have to continue the process. Okay. I hope you're seeing the right thing. Let's try. My share is being a little silly. Okay, let's look. So first of all, the pasuk on which this is based may indicate, at least the pasuk that on which the Mishnah is based, may indicate that this is about the process of the korban itself. After all, the pasuk is from Vayikra chapter 6, Vaydaber Shem Moshe lemor, God spoke to Moshe saying, Tzavet Aaron v'et banav lemor, command Aaron and his son, saying, Zo Torah Ola, here's the teaching of the Ola. Here's how it's supposed to go. Hi ha'ola al mokdal hamizbeach kol halayla ad haboker. It's supposed to be on the pyre on the mizbeach all night until the morning. V'esh hamizbeach tukad bo, and the fire of the altar is supposed to stay lit, burning it. Okay, this is the pasuk from which we learn in that first Mishnah in the ninth perek that if it goes up, it stays up. Why? Well, Rashi says, Zot Torat Ha'olah. Here is the teaching of the burnt offering. Harei ha'inyan hazeh ba lelamed al hektir chalavim ve'ivarim shehi kasher kol halayla. This is coming to teach you that the burning of the fats and the limbs of the animal is kosher all night, right? That's why we're allowed to daven marav all night. It's based on that, right? But also ulilamed ala psulin, to teach about the invalid korbanot. Eze im ala yered, which of them, if they went up to the Mizbeach, they would come down. Ve'eze im ala lo yered, and which of them, if they went up, would not come down. Shekol Torah lirabot huba. Anytime the Torah uses the word Torah, right? Zot Torat X, here is the rule of X. Lirabot huba, it's coming to expand what's included. Lomar, meaning Torah achat l'chol ha'olim, there is one law for all of the things that go up. Va'afilu psulin, even invalid things. She'im alu lo yirdu, if they go up, they shouldn't come down. Meaning the way Rashi makes it sound is Zot Torah ta'olah, meaning in some ways even this invalid korban is an olah, meaning it's on the mizbeach, you started it, you're going to continue it, right? Now, there are things that even if they go up, they do come down. And he said, and Rashi continues and says, Hi ha'olah, right? That is the olah, it's in the pasuk. Lima'id, that's coming to make exceptions to the rule of if it goes up, it doesn't come down. Namely, we don't include haroveya or hanirba. We don't include any animal that was involved in bestiality that was then put on the korban, kayotze, but that put on the mizbeach, kayotze behen, or things like that. Shelo haya psulan b'kodesh, right? Those things they were not disqualified in the azara itself. Shenifsulu kodem shaba'ul azara. They were already disqualified before they ever got into the Kodesh to begin with, right? So what it's basically saying is if it's really something that was an Ola to begin with, even if it became invalidated once it got into the Kodesh, then if it goes up, it doesn't come down because it's still an Ola of some sort, right? Even though it's technically pasul. But if it's something that never should have been an Ola in the first place, like an animal that was involved in bestiality, for example, then even if you put it on the Mizbeach, take it down, right? There's no actual process there. I also want to point out there are interesting discussions as to, well, actually, if we think about this as it is a kind of Ola continuation, then maybe the fact is you have to make sure that it meets all of the specifications of the burning of a korban olah, namely, it needs salting, right? Even though we're talking about an invalid korban. And this is Rabbi David Kohen Rappaport. He brings this up, and he wrote this about 100 years ago. He says, "B'gam bazeh yesh lachkor b'psulim." We should actually examine whether in invalid korbanot, she'im alu lo yerdu, right? The ones that if they went up on the mizbeach, they shouldn't come down. Im tzrichim melach la'aktiram. Do you need salt in order to burn them? Which is usually the rule if you're burning valid korbanot. The efshar, because maybe the rak korbanot ksherim, maybe only kosher korbanot, the haktaratan haktara ma'al yata, whose burning is actually a legitimate, halachically legitimate burning, umiratza, and actually is supposed to gain divine favor. Maybe only those tzrichim melach need the technical requirement of having salt, being salted. Aval bipsulim, but when you're talking about invalid korbanot, de'enat taratan miratza, their burning, it doesn't actually effectuate any divine will. Virakdinahu to lo yerdu. They're just up there because they're not supposed to come down. Efshar de be'elu leka din melach. Maybe there you don't need to meet the technical specifications of salting the way you would with kosher korbanot. So I think that's an interesting nafkamina. It's an interesting consequence. If you actually do look at this as a continuation of the tahalich of the process of giving this korban, even though the korban has become invalidated, then maybe you are going to salt it like anything else, right? I would say similarly, another issue that could be a nafkamina, that could be a consequence of looking at it this way is not just that you might need to salt it, but actually how it got up there in the first place. If this is actually a continuation of some sort of tahalich, of some sort of process that you started the korban process, then maybe it should conform to a rule that we see somewhere else in Menachot, Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Klei Sharet, the vessels that we use to do the avoda in the Beit HaMikdash, Ein Mekadshin El Midat. They also, by the way, consecrate whatever goes in them, similar to the Mizbeach, even if those things were invalid. But it's only if someone put them in there on purpose, right? Meaning it's only if somebody put them in there with intention that they're doing the process of avoda. So maybe the Mizbeach, similarly, if we're really thinking about this as It's like a corbanola. Yes, it's a corbanola gone bad, but you continue the process and that's why you don't take it down. Then maybe not only might it need malicha, might it need the proper salting, but also maybe it actually only stays up there if you put it up there on purpose to begin with, meaning if you actually were engaged in a process of doing the actual korban, right? So I want to just pause right there and basically say that this side of the ledger is really understanding this as, look, not every korban is actually kasher, but once you've started the process, you got to continue the process. And we're not going to create these different tracks for, sometimes you leave it up there and sometimes you don't. If it's actually something that was kosher until it got into the Azarat and something happened to it. Now, I can imagine technical reasons for not wanting to do that, practical reasons for not wanting to do that, maybe ideological reasons for not wanting to do that, meaning something's up on the Mizbeach, unless it's something that really is so disgusting it shouldn't be on the Mizbeach, right? Like it's just so off. It's not a korban at all. Unless it's that, keep the process going. The other side of the ledger is actually, no, this is really about the Kedusha of the Mizbech. It's really not about the identity at all of the Korban. It's really about the Kedusha of the Mizbech. And some people point to the fact that there's a different pasuk that's sometimes used to learn this law of the Mizbeach is Mekadesh et Hara'uelo. The Mizbeach makes things Kodesh. And that is a pasuk that shows up in Shmot Perek Kaftet. The pasuk is Shiv'at yamim techaper al hamizbeach v'kidashta oto. For 7 days, you are going to do purification on the altar and you're going to consecrate it, right? We're talking about the consecration of the Mishkan. V'haya hamizbeach kodesh kodeshim, and the Mizbeach is going to be very holy. Kol hanogeh b'mizbeach yikdash. Anything that touches the altar will become consecrated. Now, I want you to think to yourself already. If you use a pasuk that says, this is the Olah, this is the Torah of the Olah, and it's coming to teach you there's one Torah for any animal that was kosher for the Olah until it came into the Azara and something happened to it, and you have to, once it's on the Mizbeach, you don't take it down. That's very different from learning it from a pasuk that says anything that touches the altar becomes sacred. Anything that touches the altar becomes sacred becomes not about the identity of the item, because it's anything. It becomes about the Mizbeach, the identity of the Mizbeach. And that's where some people learn this halakha from of im Allah lo yired. If it went up, it shouldn't come down. Or alternately, hamizbeach mekadesh et ha'ra'uilo. The altar sanctifies things that are appropriate for it. And don't confuse appropriate for kosher. Appropriate means it was appropriate to be a korban in the first place, even though it was invalidated later. So look at Zevachim Pei Gimel Amud Bet, for example, right? The other side, the other folio from where the original Mishnah that we spoke about showed up. Rabbi Yossi HaGlili Omer, Rabbi Yossi HaGlili says, Mitoch Shneimar Kol Hanogeh B'Mizbeach Yikdash, since we have a pasuk that says anything that touches the Mizbeach becomes sanctified, Shomea Ani, I might learn Bein Ra'ui Uvein She'ein Ra'ui, that maybe that should be applied to whether it's something that was valid as a korban at some point or was never valid as a korban at some point because it's kol hanogeh. It's anything that touches. Talmud lomar. No, no, no. We have the next pasuk actually uses the word kvasim, right? It uses the word kvasim. It uses the word lambs. Ma kvasim re'uyin af kol re'ui. Just like lambs are fit for the altar, so too anything that's fit for the altar, right? And then Rabbi Akiva has his own limud. But the point is, we're using it from a very different pasuk, and that other pasuk that we're using it from is actually much more about the mizbeach itself. And in fact, I want to actually look at some of the commentators and how they look at that pasuk to begin with, because when we look at that pasuk in its own context, it's not even clear that what that pasuk is trying to say is anybody who touches it will become Kodesh, or anything that touches it become Kodesh. And that might be the reason why some people don't use that pasuk for it in the first place. Okay, so let's take a look. So it is the case that some of the Mefarshim on anything that touches the Mikdash, anything that touches the Mizbeach will become Kodesh, actually understand it differently. The Ibn Ezra, for example, actually thinks that maybe what it's talking about is Yesh Omrim, some people think Yalalechem levado yedaber. It's talking about the bread that was given at the time of uh the um dedication of the Mishkan, right? Really, matzah that was given at the time of the dedication of Mishkan. Shelo yig'u im lo yiyu kidoshim, that nobody is allowed to touch it unless they themselves are kadosh. Meaning, v'atam shelo yiyu tmeim. They're not supposed to be ritually impure. So kol hanogeh b'mizbeach yikdash is anybody who wants to eat the stuff that's coming down from the mizbeach has to yikdash. They have to actually purify themselves, right? Maybe they're looking at that differently. And in fact, he's not the only one who thinks that, right? Chizkuni says the same thing. He says, Kol harotze ligabo, anybody who wants to touch the Mizbeach, yizamin v'yitaher etzmo mikodem lachen. They actually should go and purify themselves beforehand. Yikdash actually means they have to go through purification. Now, of course, that's not the way that Chazal understand it. The way that Chazal understand it is Kol hanogeya B'mizbeach yikdash means anything that touches the mizbeach is going to become kodesh. And the Ktav v'Kabbalah, who often was somebody who tried to figure out the relationship between the pshat, the plain meaning of a pasuk, and the way that the rabbis interpreted it, he actually has a whole discussion as to why does it say anything that touches the mizbeach should become clean. That makes it sound like it actually has to touch it, and it actually makes it sound like it's not enough for a kohen to be holding it on top of the mizbeach, which halachically it is enough for it not to be able to go back down. It also sounds like, maybe it sounds a little bit more like the pshat position, that what it really means is if you're going to touch any of these things, you have to yikdash, meaning you're going to purify yourself. Maybe it has nothing to do with the altar. It has to do with touching things that come from the altar, or not nothing to do with the altar, but it has to do with touching the altar, not what the altar touches, right? So he actually suggests, and it's just an interesting suggestion. He says, Lashon nigiyah, the term of to touch. Yishamshu rabotenu harbe, the rabbis use it ala shayachut sheyesh ledavar im davar. They use it to talk about the relationship between one thing and another, or the affinity between one thing and another. Kilshonam, like their language of nogea be'edut. If you say somebody is nogea be'edut, it means, wait a second, they are implicated, right? They stand something to gain. They are affiliated somehow with this testimony, and that is a problem. We don't want somebody who's nogea be'edut, right? So being nogea badavar, right? Being affiliated with a matter, and things like this. So he says, she'enu ki'im negi'ah machshavit v'hitkarvut udvekut ritzoni. It's not literally touching, there's an affinity with it. V'al negi'ah machshavit kazo she'ena ki'im shayachut, and on this kind of affinity, which is not about literal touching, Ramaz kra b'kavanah shni'ah, the pasuk suggested with some sort of secondary intention, Belashon hanogea b'mizbeach, that which touches the mizbeach, klomar, meaning kol korban shayalo shayachut b'mizbeach. It has to be a korban that somehow was shayach, somehow was appropriate, right, from the mizbeach at some point, meaning kigon shahaya ra'ui liut nikrav al mizbeach, meaning it originally was fitting to be put on the mizbeach. So he's really trying to deal with the fact that it's, kol hanogea, everything that touches. He says, no, it's not literally everything that touches, because you could have a kohen standing up there and holding it, and it doesn't have to literally touch the mizbeach, right? Not everything that touches. But this is him also trying to work with the difference between the pshat and the way that Chazal understand it. But let's think again about what would happen if this is the way you learn, if this is your understanding of why kol, Allah lo yered, if it went up, it doesn't come down, that it's actually about the identity of the Mizbeach. It's actually about the Mizbeach in some ways asserting its sanctity and transferring some of its sanctity to whatever is there. Well, let's go back to what we read in Rav Rappaport. Rav Rappaport basically said, well, do you actually need some sort of process of malicha? Do you need some process of salting the way you would for a kosher korban? This perspective would say absolutely not. There's nothing about this animal that's a korban. Don't think about it as a korban anymore. It's the same as just burning wood on top of the mizbeach. It's all about the mizbeach. You don't have to do that. Or the question of, what about shalomidat? What if you put it on the mizbeach in an unthinking manner? You didn't put it on the mizbeach thinking, this is the beginning of a process of doing a korban. You just didn't think about it, or it actually got there by default. It got thrown up there. Who knows? It, if it's about the Mizbeach actually causing a degree of Kiddusha to be transferred, then who cares how it got up there? Either way, it shouldn't be able to come down. If we sort of take a step back and we ask ourselves, what do we get out of one versus the other? I would say, especially when we're talking about the Mizbeach, because we're talking about something that actually is in a place and doesn't move, right? I think conceptually, when you say that the Mizbeach actually gives its Kedusha to something else, gives its consecration to something else, then you're really focused on the identity of that place in the Beit HaMikdash. Whereas if you're talking about this is a continued process of korbanot, then what you're really talking about is the process of avoda, the process of worship that you usually go through. And that is something that we want to stay uniform all the time. So is Kedusha contagious? Well, probably depends which one of these roads you choose to go down, you will look at it as more or less contagious. It's also interesting to consider that maybe the Mizbeach is Mekadesh for one reason, and the other Klei Sharet are Mekadshim for another reason. Maybe the Mizbeach is actually about the Kedusha of the place and the thing itself, whereas maybe for the Klei Sharet, it's actually about you started a process and you're working through a process of doing avoda, and we're not going to stop you in the middle, even though what you're doing is something that has been invalidated. As always, thanks for learning with me.